morning, Edward Ashford collapsed against the frame of his bedroom door, his hands shaking so badly that the glass of water he had been carrying shattered on the stone floor. Not a single member of his family was in the house. The servants who heard the crash came running, and it was old Henry, the groundskeeper, who helped the Duke back to his bed. Edward sat on the edge of the mattress with his head bowed, breathing carefully, as if each breath needed deliberate permission. Henry stood in the doorway holding a dustpan and broom he had grabbed without thinking, unsure whether to speak or stay quiet. Edward looked at his own hands, as though they belonged to someone else. Then he straightened his back, lifted his chin, and told Henry to sweep up the glass and say nothing to anyone. That was how it began for Edward Ashford, the Duke of Renfield. Not with ceremony or announcement, not with the kind of dramatic moment that stories sometimes manufacture for the sake of impact. It began with a broken glass, a pair of trembling hands, and a proud man sitting alone on the edge of his bed, in a house that had grown far too large for the life being lived inside it. Edward had been the Duke of Renfield for 31 years. Before that, he had been the son of the previous Duke, and before that, he had been a boy who rode horses too fast across the northern fields of the estate, and got his ears pulled by his mother for tracking mud through the East Corridor. Renfield Manor sat on 400 acres of land in the English countryside, a place of stone walls and old trees, and the kind of deep, settled quiet that comes only from centuries of the same family occupying the same ground. It was beautiful in the way that old things are beautiful, not because they shine, but because they endure. Edward had grown into a man who matched his estate, broad-shouldered in his younger years, now leaner, but still carrying himself with the unhurried steadiness of someone who had never once needed to rush to prove anything. He had dark eyes that people sometimes found uncomfortable, not because they were unkind, but because they did not look away when others expected them to. He had been a fair duke, a demanding employer, and a complicated husband, and he knew himself well enough to admit to at least two of those three things without being asked. His wife, Dorothy, had died 4 years before the morning of the broken glass. She had been ill for 2 years before that, and Edward had sat beside her bed every evening during those 2 years, reading to her, from whatever book she had most recently loved, holding her hand when she could not sleep, and pretending, for her sake, that he was not afraid. Dorothy had been the warmer of the two of them. She had been the one who remembered birthdays, and wrote personal notes to the staff at Christmas, and laughed at herself when she made mistakes. After she was gone, the manor felt differently weighted, as if something structural had been quietly removed, and the rest of the building was only now beginning to notice. Their 3 children had grown up in Renfield and then left it, as children do. Gerald was the eldest, 40 years old now, and running the family's land management business from offices in the city. He was efficient and sharp, and spoke in the kind of measured sentences that left no room for misunderstanding or warmth. Portia was 37, married to a man named Charles, who came from another old family, and she lived in a large house 3 counties away, and filled her life with social obligations that she described as duties, and others might have called distractions. And then there was Oliver, the youngest at 33, who had his mother's easy smile and his father's worst habit of taking things for granted, and who had spent the better part of a decade moving between flats in various cities, funding a lifestyle that he contributed nothing toward, other than his own enjoyment of it. Edward had provided for all 3 of them generously. He had paid for educations, and weddings, and business capital, and flat deposits, and emergency funds, that were neither emergencies nor particularly fund-like. He had done it without keeping score, because Dorothy had asked him to, and because in his own gruff way, he had believed that family supported family, without measuring. But as he sat on his bed that morning, with his hands still trembling, and the sound of Henry's broom moving across the floor in the hallway, he thought about his children. And what he felt was not anger, not yet. It was something closer to the feeling of reaching into a coat pocket that you were certain contained something important, and finding it empty. The trembling in his hands was not new. It had started 8 months earlier, so gradually that he had initially mistaken it for tiredness. He was 67 years old. Tiredness was a reasonable explanation. He had mentioned it once to his doctor, a careful man named Dr. Wells, who had nodded in that way doctors nod when they want more time, before they say something definite. Blood was drawn. Tests were ordered. Edward had returned to his life in the interval, with the kind of deliberate normalcy that people practice when they suspect the answer might not be a comfortable one. He had sat across from Edward in the manor's small study, the one with the bookshelves that reached the ceiling, and the window that looked out over the west garden, and he had said the words clearly, and without softening them more than was necessary. Edward had listened. He had asked 2 questions, both precise. He had thanked Dr. Wells for his directness, and after the doctor left, he had sat in the study for a long time without moving, looking out at the garden where the roses Dorothy had planted 20 years ago were still growing, overgrown now, but stubbornly alive. The condition had a long medical name that Edward did not bother memorizing. What it meant, in plain language, was this: the nerves in his body were beginning to fail. Slowly, in most cases, Dr. Wells had said, but progressively and without reversal. The trembling in his hands would spread. His strength would decline. There would be periods of stability and periods of worsening, and over time, the worsening would outpace the stability. It was not a death sentence, Dr. Wells had said, not immediately, not necessarily for many years, but it was a change in the map. Things that had been possible would become difficult. Things that were difficult would become impossible. And Edward would need help, consistent and attentive help, sooner than his pride would likely want to admit. Edward had not told his children at once. He was not entirely certain why. Perhaps because he had spent 31 years as the man who held things together, and announcing that he was now in need of holding was not something he could do without preparation. Or perhaps because some part of him, older and less examined than the rest, already sensed what their responses might be, and wanted to delay confirming it. When he finally gathered them in the manor's dining room on a Sunday in late September, he told them plainly, the way he did most things. Gerald sat at the long table with his hands folded and his expression professionally composed. Portia sat beside him and pressed her lips together in a way that looked like concern, but moved very quickly toward the practical. Oliver sat at the end of the table and looked at the wood grain and said nothing for a long time. Edward laid out the situation, the diagnosis, the likely progression, the fact that his management of the estate would need adjusting, the possibility that the staff would need expanding, specifically, the household support available to him directly. The silence that followed was informative in ways that Edward did not yet fully want to process. Gerald was the first to speak. He said that this was serious news, and that he would need time to think about the implications for the business structure. He said it in the tone of someone who had just received a complicated briefing and was already sorting it into action items. Portia asked whether a second medical opinion had been sought. When Edward said yes, she nodded and looked at her hands. Oliver said that he was sorry, and he seemed to mean it in the moment, which was something, even if it did not quite reach far enough to become anything else. They stayed for lunch. They left by mid-afternoon, and Edward returned to his study, to the view of the west garden, and understood something quietly and without drama. He understood that the people most likely to appear at his side in the coming months were not going to be the people who shared his name. In the weeks after the diagnosis, the manor's routine continued, as routines do, because life does not pause for its participants to absorb what has happened. The staff managed the daily operations of the house with the same quiet competence they had always maintained. There were 6 of them in the household proper. Henry, who managed the grounds with the help of a young assistant named Pete, Mrs. Garland, the cook, who had been at Renfield for 19 years and whose authority in the kitchen was absolute and unquestioned. A couple who came 3 days a week for the heavier cleaning, Walter and his wife June, and 2 younger women who handled the remaining household tasks, whose schedules overlapped in ways that ensured the house was attended through most of the daylight hours. One of those 2 was Alara Moss. She had come to Renfield 3 years earlier, at 24 years old, quiet and steady, and not at all the kind of person who drew attention to herself. She came from a village about 12 miles east of the estate, the kind of village that people from cities drive through without slowing. Her father had died when she was 16. Her mother worked long hours at a dry goods shop and had 2 younger children still at home. Alara had taken the position at Renfield because it paid reliably, and the estate was close enough that she could visit home on her days off. She was not unhappy in her work. She was not particularly visible in it either. She did what was asked of her, and occasionally a little more, and she did not advertise the extra. Edward, in 31 years as Duke, had rarely had cause to speak at length with the household staff, beyond instructions and acknowledgments. This was not cruelty. It was simply the architecture of the life he had lived, built along lines that had existed long before him, and that he had never thought to question. He knew their names. He knew Mrs. Garland's husband had passed 3 years prior, and that she had not taken a single day off for grief. He knew Henry's back troubled him in cold weather, and that this was never mentioned unless you looked closely at how he moved. He did not know Alara well at all. He had noticed her the way you notice a piece of furniture that has always been in the right place, reliably present, unremarkable. What Edward did not know, because nobody had told him, and he had not had occasion to observe it, was that Alara Moss noticed nearly everything. She noticed which of the manor's windows let in drafts, and which rugs had been placed to cover worn patches in the floor beneath. She noticed when the coal was getting low, before Mrs. Garland mentioned it. She noticed the rhythm of the house, the way a musician notices rhythm, not by thinking about it, but by listening automatically, and feeling it when something shifted. And 8 months before the broken glass, she had noticed that the Duke was not quite himself. It had started with small things. A cup replaced at a slightly different angle. A chair in the library moved a little closer to the table, as if the reach between them had quietly become a fraction too long. A book left open on a windowsill, at a page that could only have been reached if someone was taking longer with each paragraph, rereading what should have been simple. She had not known what any of this meant. She had simply noticed it, and held it the way careful people hold things they do not yet have names for. And then one evening, 3 months before the diagnosis, she had been turning down the corridor near the main staircase when she saw Edward at the top of the stairs, one hand resting on the banister, not descending. He stood there for a moment, longer than a pause but shorter than a stop, and then he came down slowly, steadily, but with a deliberateness that was new. She had moved quietly away before he reached the bottom. She had not wanted him to see her seeing him. That was the kind of person Alara Moss was. Not because she had been trained to be invisible, though the work had shaped her that way, but because she had understood from a young age that there was a difference between watching people and seeing them, and that the second one required a kind of care for the person being seen that the first did not. She had watched her own father lose his strength gradually, in the last year of his life, when his heart had begun to fail. She had watched her mother hold the household together through it, quietly and without complaint, making adjustments so small that her father often didn't realize things had been moved or changed on his behalf. Alara had learned something from that. She had learned that dignity was something you could protect in another person, if you were thoughtful enough about how you went about it. By the time Edward's family gathered for that Sunday lunch and left before evening, Alara had already, without realizing it, begun to pay closer attention to the particular ways in which the manor would need to adjust. She had begun doing this not because anyone had told her to, not because it was part of her duties in any formal sense, but because she was the kind of person for whom noticing and responding were not two separate actions. They arrived together. In the days following that family meeting, the house settled back into its usual quiet. Gerald wrote a letter from the city, outlining his thoughts on adjusting certain provisions in the estate management documents. Portia sent a brief note asking whether Edward had considered hiring a full-time personal attendant and suggesting a service she had heard of from a friend. Oliver did not write at all that week, and Edward did not mention it to anyone. He read Gerald's letter in the study, folded it precisely, and placed it in the drawer, where he kept correspondence he intended to return to later. Some of those letters had been in that drawer for years. Edward Ashford was not a man who expressed what he felt in obvious ways. He had been raised to consider emotional restraint a form of respect, and he had practiced it so long that it had become indistinguishable from his natural character. But restraint, when practiced for decades, does not erase what lies beneath it. It only insulates it, the way a heavy coat keeps the cold from reaching you, but cannot change the fact of the cold existing. Edward felt his children's absence with precision. He did not weep about it, did not speak of it, did not allow himself to sit in it for long. But he felt it, in the empty dining room, in the corner of his study, where Dorothy's reading chair still sat at an angle toward the window, in the particular silence of a large house that contains only one person who matters to it. October arrived with cold mornings and the smell of wood smoke that always rose from the groundskeeping shed when Henry burned the season's last fallen branches. The leaves on the old oaks at the edge of the north field turned the color of rust. Edward moved through his days with the same careful discipline he had always applied to himself, managing correspondence and estate decisions, and meetings with his solicitor, and conversations with Dr. Wells, who came now twice a month, and who had begun, gently, to discuss what the coming months might require in practical terms. Edward listened. He answered questions. He did not ask for more than the information presented, and he did not offer more than what was asked. Dr. Wells, who had known Edward for 17 years, recognized this and did not push. And then came the morning of the broken glass. October the 14th. Henry, sweeping in the hallway. Edward sitting on the edge of his bed. The west garden visible through the window. The roses, dark and leafless now, stripped by the first cold nights. His hands in his lap, still trembling. He looked at them for a long time. And then he stood up, straightened his back, walked to the window, and looked out at the grounds he had managed and tended and argued with, and loved, for 67 years. The light was low and pale. A bird moved across the open sky above the oak trees. Henry's broom went quiet in the hallway. Edward Ashford was not the kind of man who made speeches to empty rooms. But standing at that window, with his unsteady hands, and his quiet house, and the long road ahead of him, already becoming visible in its difficulty, he made himself a private promise. He would not beg his children to care about him. He would not perform suffering for the sake of their attention. But he would not pretend, either. He was ill. The house knew it. The staff knew it. And somewhere in the corridor below, moving quietly from room to room, with the unhurried attentiveness of someone who had noticed everything and said nothing, a young woman named Alara Moss already knew it better than anyone else in Edward Ashford's life. He had not yet understood what that meant. He would. The letter that Gerald wrote the week after the Sunday lunch in the dining room was 4 paragraphs long. Edward read it twice. The first reading was for information. The second reading was for the thing beneath the information, the thing that letters like this contain, even when the writer believes they have been careful to leave it out. Gerald's letter discussed the estate's financial structure, the management agreements, the documents that would need updating to reflect what he called Edward's changing circumstances. It was competent and thorough, and read like something produced by a man who had gone home from Sunday lunch and immediately begun thinking about logistics. There was one line, near the end, where Gerald wrote that he hoped his father was managing as well as could be expected, and that he trusted the staff to ensure the household was properly attended. It was the only line that came close to resembling something personal, and even then, it directed the concern toward the staff, rather than toward Edward himself. Edward placed the letter in the drawer without responding, not because he did not intend to respond, but because he needed more time than he expected to find the right tone for his reply. Finding the right tone had never been difficult for him before. He was a man who had written difficult letters his entire life, letters about death, letters about legal disputes, letters declining requests and delivering decisions that other people did not want to hear. The difficulty with Gerald's letter was different. It was not that he did not know what to say, it was that what he wanted to say, and what was appropriate to say, were two different things, separated by the kind of distance that years of silence creates in a relationship between a parent and a child. October moved through the estate quietly. The days shortened, and the light changed quality, going from the soft gold of early autumn to something thinner and more honest, the kind of light that illuminates without flattering, that shows things as they are, rather than as they could be. Edward found this kind of clarity useful, even when it was uncomfortable. He had always been a man who preferred reality to optimism, and the reality of October was that his condition was advancing, that his family's attention was directed elsewhere, and that the days ahead would require him to depend on people in ways he had not previously been required to consider. He had not hired a full-time personal attendant. He had considered Portia's suggestion, and set it aside. Not because the idea was wrong, but because bringing a stranger into the house, for the specific purpose of watching over him, felt, at this particular moment, like a step he was not ready to take. The staff were not strangers. They were not family either, but they occupied the comfortable middle ground of people who were known without being intimate, and Edward found that easier to navigate than the idea of someone new, whose sole job was to observe his decline. And so the house continued as it was. Mrs. Garland in the kitchen, Henry on the grounds, Walter and June, 3 days a week, and Alara and a young woman named Helen, alternating the household tasks. Helen was 22, and cheerful, in the transparent way of young people who have not yet had much reason to be anything else. She and Alara worked well together, which is to say they did not get in each other's way, and they shared information about the house's needs without drama. Helen's attention was thorough in the rooms she was responsible for, and present, but not particularly attuned in the way Alara's was. This was not a criticism of Helen. Very few people move through the world the way Alara did. What was happening during October, beneath the surface of the manor's ordinary operation, was a quiet and gradual adjustment that no one had formally arranged or discussed. Alara had begun, without announcement, to attend to certain details of the house's routine in ways that had less to do with the house and more to do with the particular difficulties of a man whose hands were becoming unreliable. The shaving kit that sat on the bathroom shelf near the Duke's room had been moved 3 inches to the left, which made it reachable without the reaching requiring balance. The book on the nightstand had been rotated so that its spine faced the lamp rather than the wall, which meant Edward could lift it with one hand along the spine without needing to grip the cover. The small rug that ran from the doorway of his bedroom toward the corridor had been pinned flat at both ends, so that its edges no longer lifted slightly in the middle, where a foot catching it could mean a fall. None of these things were listed in Alara's responsibilities. None of them had been requested, and none of them had been done in any way that called attention to themselves or to the person who had arranged them. To a casual observer, nothing had changed. To someone who was looking carefully, everything had been quietly, thoughtfully adjusted. Edward noticed. He was a precise man, and a thorough one, and he noticed the small shifts, even when he did not immediately understand their origin. On a Tuesday morning in mid-October, he stood at the bathroom shelf and reached for the shaving kit, and found it exactly where his hand went, without looking. He paused. He had not put it there. Or rather, he had put it somewhere nearby for many years, and it had not been exactly there before. He did not say anything. But that evening, coming down the main staircase to the sitting room, he found that the light in the lower hallway had been changed. The single lamp that had sat on the credenza near the bottom of the stairs was now flanked by a second one, placed on the small table that had previously held only a decorative bowl. The combined light made the bottom of the staircase easier to see, easier to step onto without misjudging. We stood at the base of the stairs for a moment. Then he went into the sitting room and spent the evening reading. In the servants' areas of the house, in the conversations that passed between staff during the parts of the day when they were together without the Duke nearby, Alara's adjustments were not discussed directly. This was partly because Alara herself did not bring them up, but it was also because the staff of Renfield Manor were, as a group, possessed of the particular professional discretion that long service in a single household tends to produce. They saw things, they understood things, and they had a collective, unspoken agreement to conduct themselves with a level of dignity, on the Duke's behalf, that his own family had not currently managed to offer. Mrs. Garland was the one who came closest to saying it plainly. One afternoon in late October, when Alara was in the kitchen, helping to bring in supplies from the delivery, and Mrs. Garland was at the table, making a list of what would be needed for the week, the older woman looked up from her list and said, without particular emphasis, that the Duke had eaten better the last 3 days than he had the month before. Alara said that was good to hear. Mrs. Garland said that she had noticed the meals were being set earlier in the evening now, closer to 6 than 7, and that the portions were smaller, but the dishes were warmer by the time they were delivered. She said this in a tone that was not quite a question. Alara said that she had read somewhere that smaller and more frequent meals sometimes helped with certain kinds of fatigue. Mrs. Garland looked at her for a moment, over the top of her reading glasses, and then looked back at her list. She did not say anything else. But the next morning, there was a small piece of shortbread wrapped in cloth on the tray that Alara was preparing for the Duke's mid-morning tea, and Mrs. Garland said nothing about it, which was itself a kind of saying everything. Edward, for his part, was managing. This was the word he used when anyone asked, and it was technically accurate. He was managing his condition, his household, his schedule, his correspondence, and the many small adjustments required by a life that was shifting beneath him. He was managing with the effort of a man who had always managed, and who had not yet found a way to stop, even when managing had become more costly than it used to be. There were mornings when the trembling was worse, and he dressed slowly and carefully, each button a small negotiation. There were afternoons when the fatigue that Dr. Wells had warned him about arrived like weather, sudden and total, and he would sit in the study chair by the west window, and not read or write or think in any productive way, just sit, which was its own small defeat for a man who had never sat without purpose. There were evenings when the house felt very large and very quiet, and he would think about Dorothy, not with grief exactly, but with the particular sharpness of missing someone who would have known, without being told, exactly what to say. He did not reach out to his children again in October. He waited to see if they would reach out to him. Gerald sent a follow-up letter about the estate documents, brisk and efficient. Portia telephoned once and asked how he was feeling. He said he was managing. She said that was good, and mentioned a charity dinner she was helping to organize, and then said she had to go, and would try to visit before Christmas. Oliver did not contact him during all of October. Edward did not record this fact anywhere, did not speak of it, did not allow himself to linger on it. But it was there. It took up a particular kind of space in the house that had no furniture in it, and no view from any window, just an absence where something should have been. The last week of October brought rain that came in sideways off the northern fields and made the old manor settle and creak in ways that sounded almost conversational. Henry's assistant Pete put extra bracing around the kitchen garden beds. Mrs. Garland stocked the pantry more thoroughly than usual, the way people who have lived through hard winters do without discussing it. The house prepared itself for cold in the competent, unsentimentalized way of old buildings that have been through many seasons and know exactly what is coming. On the last Thursday of October, Edward was coming down the main staircase to meet Dr. Wells for his fortnightly appointment, when his right leg did not do precisely what he asked it to do. It was not a fall. His hand found the banister, and he caught himself before anything worse happened. And he stood there for a moment, with his hand gripping the carved wood, and his weight shifted onto his left side, and his breath quiet and controlled. At the bottom of the stairs, the hallway was empty, or he thought it was. He steadied himself, and came down the remaining steps carefully, and walked toward the study. What he did not see was Alara, who had been coming from the direction of the sitting room when she saw the Duke on the stairs. Would she had stopped. She had stayed still. She had not moved forward, because she had understood, in an instant, that moving forward would mean he knew she had seen, and that knowing she had seen would be its own kind of difficulty for a proud man on an uncertain staircase. She had stayed exactly where she was, at the edge of the doorway, close enough that if he had fallen she would have been there within seconds, far enough that he descended without knowing she was watching. When he reached the bottom and walked toward the study, she let out a breath and continued quietly in the direction of the linen cupboard, which was where she had been going before any of this happened. She did not tell anyone what she had seen. She went home that evening and sat with her mother over a cup of tea and talked about ordinary things. Her mother mentioned that her younger brother had done well in his school exams. Alara said that was wonderful. She ate her dinner and helped with the dishes and went to bed. But before she slept, in the quiet of her small room in the village house, she thought about the staircase and the way Edward Ashford's hand had found the banister, with the instinct of a man who had expected to need it. And she thought about what the coming months might look like, and about what she could do, quietly and without announcement, to make them a little less difficult for a man who was going to resist help with every dignified fiber of his character, and who was going to need it anyway. She was not afraid of the work. She had been doing it, in one form or another, since she was 16 years old. Caring for people was not something she had chosen in the grand sense. It was something she had discovered she was built for, the way some people discover they are built for numbers or music, not through dramatic revelation, but through the accumulated evidence of daily life, showing them, again and again, where they are most fully themselves. She thought about this for a little while, and then she turned off the lamp and went to sleep, because tomorrow was a Friday, and Friday at Renfield was always a full day, and she wanted to be ready for it. November arrived without apology. The temperature dropped sharply in the first week, and the grounds of Renfield Manor hardened with the overnight frost that turned the mud of October into ridged and uneven paths by morning. Henry and Pete worked the first days of the month, clearing the worst of the water from the low areas near the north fence, and the air across the estate had that particular quality that belongs only to early winter, cold enough to feel in the back of the throat, sharp and clean, and entirely without mercy. Edward had never minded the cold. He was a northern man by temperament, even if the estate sat in the Midlands, and he found the brisk weather of November preferable to the damp gloom of March, or the heavy stillness of August afternoons. He said as much to Dr. Wells during their appointment in the first week of the month, and Wells, who was younger than Edward by 15 years and grew up somewhere warmer, said that he was glad the Duke found something to appreciate about the season. Edward looked at him without expression for a moment, and then said that he had been told that a sense of humor was good for the constitution. Wells allowed himself a small smile, and then returned to his notes. The appointments with Dr. Wells were now the most consistent human contact Edward had outside of the staff. This was a fact he recognized without dwelling on it. Wells was professional and careful, and he was one of those people who manages to be both honest and kind, without either quality undermining the other, which is a less common combination than it sounds. He had begun to ask, during each appointment, not only about physical symptoms, but about the shape of Edward's days generally. How was he sleeping? What was he eating? How were the stairs treating him? Wells asked this in a particular tone the second time, which told Edward that Henry had said something to Wells at some point, which told Edward that his groundskeeper was more perceptive than his children. He filed this information away without comment. The physical changes Edward was navigating in November went beyond the trembling that had been his earliest symptom. There was now a general unevenness to his strength that made some tasks straightforward and others unexpectedly effortful, in ways that did not follow consistent rules. On some mornings he felt close to his old self. On others he felt the Renfield staircase, like a small personal adversary. His grip was less reliable than it had been, which meant anything that required sustained pressure was now something to be thought about, rather than simply done. He had adjusted to writing with a heavier pen, which required less grip force. He had moved his reading chair 2 feet closer to the lamp. He had begun to eat breakfast in the smaller dining room, rather than the main one, which required less walking from the kitchen when it was brought up, which meant it arrived a few degrees warmer, which was a practical consideration he told himself was the only reason for the change. He did not examine too closely the other possible reason, which was that the main dining room with its long table set for one was a particular kind of discouragement he did not need over breakfast. It was in the second week of November that Oliver arrived unannounced. Edward was in the study when Henry came to say that Mr. Oliver was at the door. Edward set down the letter he had been reading and said to show him in. Oliver came into the study, looking like a man who has had a long journey and is using the length of it as a reason for the expression on his face. He was his father's youngest child by 4 years, and there was still something in his face of the boy who had followed his older siblings around the estate, not quite keeping up and not quite willing to stop trying. He sat down in the chair across from Edward's desk and looked around the study, the way you look at a place you have known for a long time and not seen recently, taking in the familiar details with something that might have been feeling and might have been simply the adjustment of memory to reality. He asked how Edward was. Edward said he was managing. Oliver said he should have come sooner, and Edward said that he was here now. Neither of these statements was untrue, and neither of them was quite enough, but they sat between the two men like a small bridge across a large distance, which was better than nothing. Oliver stayed for 3 days. He slept in the East Wing bedroom he had grown up in, and he ate meals with Edward in the smaller dining room, which meant those meals were taken by 2 people rather than 1, and which changed the quality of the silence in the room in ways that Edward acknowledged to himself were welcome. Oliver helped with nothing in particular. He was not a practical man. He walked the grounds with Henry for an hour on the second morning, and Henry was polite and informative, and privately assessed the younger Ashford in the direct and unglamorous way that people who work with their hands tend to assess people who do not. Oliver sat with his father in the study after dinner both evenings, and they talked about things that were adjacent to what mattered, orbiting the center without quite landing there. On the evening of the second day, Oliver asked Edward whether he had thought about what would happen when things became more difficult. Edward said that he had thought about it. Oliver asked whether there was a plan. Edward said there were arrangements being made, and that they were adequate. Oliver was quiet for a moment, and then said that he was sorry he had not been here more. Edward looked at him for a long time. Then he said that Oliver was here now, and this time the statement carried less of a bridge and more of a reminder. Oliver left on the third morning. He hugged his father, which was not something that had happened with great frequency in either direction, and Edward stood straight and returned it briefly, and then stepped back. Oliver's car disappeared down the estate drive, and Henry watched it go from the groundskeeping shed where he was sorting tools, and said nothing to anyone. Edward returned to the study. He sat at the desk. He looked at the west garden through the window. The roses were completely bare now, nothing but dark thin sticks rising out of the ground in the pattern that Dorothy had once designed so carefully, with a piece of graph paper and a set of colored pencils. He remembered the afternoon she had shown him the plan. He had said it looked complicated, and she had said that was the point, and he had said very well, and gone back to whatever he had been reading. He had not fully understood the plan for years, until it grew, and became the thing it was supposed to be, and then he had understood that the complications were what made it worth looking at. He was thinking about this when Alara knocked on the open study door. She was carrying his mid-morning tea on a small tray, and behind the cup, there was a piece of Mrs. Garland's shortbread and a folded cloth napkin, and the whole arrangement was so quietly correct that Edward almost said something about it. Instead, he told her to set it on the corner of the desk. She set it down with the careful attention she brought to everything, and turned to go. Edward said, without quite deciding to, that she could leave the door open if she liked. Alara turned back. She looked at him in that way she had of paying full attention without making it feel like observation. Then she said, "Of course," and left the door open, and went back down the corridor. Edward picked up his tea. It was exactly the right temperature. It always was these days, which he had begun to understand was not a coincidence. He drank it slowly, looking at the garden, thinking about complicated plans and the things they eventually become. The cold deepened through November's second half, and into the beginning of December. The estate settled into its winter rhythm, which was slower and more interior than the rest of the year. The outdoor work reduced to maintenance, the indoor tasks gathering a domestic closeness that the larger and more active seasons did not produce. Fires burned in the main rooms from mid-morning onward, and the smell of wood smoke and the sound of the weather against the old windows became the permanent ambient quality of daily life at Renfield Manor, the way the smell of cut grass belongs to July there, and the smell of mud to March. The Edward Ashford moved through this familiar winter atmosphere with the particular consciousness of a man who has begun to pay attention to things he had previously taken for granted. He noticed the warmth of the rooms, which had always been there. He noticed the competence of his household staff, which had always been evident, and he was beginning to notice, with increasing and somewhat uncomfortable clarity, that the young woman named Alara Moss was the reason certain parts of his day were working considerably better than they would otherwise have been. He had not said this to anyone. He was not yet entirely certain how to think about it himself. The adjustments had continued and expanded. Not dramatically. That was never how they arrived. They arrived the way good solutions often do, so naturally aligned with what was needed, that they did not announce themselves as additions, but simply as the way things were. The corridor between his bedroom and the study now had a small wooden cabinet placed against the wall, at exactly the midpoint, low enough to be inconspicuous, but at the right height for a hand to rest on in passing. Edward had noticed it the third day it was there, when his hand found it without his looking, and he understood from the quality of the contact that it was placed with intention. He had stood there for a moment, hand on the polished wood, and felt something move through him that he did not immediately name. The name for it was gratitude, but it arrived alongside something more complicated, which was the awareness that someone had noticed what he needed before he had fully admitted it to himself. And for a man who had spent a lifetime as the one who noticed what others needed, who had run an estate and a family and a set of business interests by being the most perceptive person in any given room, this reversal was not something he could absorb quickly. It required processing. He processed it the way he processed most things, quietly and without external performance, while sitting in the study or walking the shorter routes around the grounds on the clearer mornings. What he arrived at, after some days, was something less complicated than he had expected. It was simply this. He had been fortunate, in a way that had nothing to do with his title or his estate or any of the advantages his life had provided, to have near him at this particular time a person whose attention was of the rare kind that does not diminish the person receiving it. Most forms of help, when a person is vulnerable, carry in them some shadow of pity or discomfort, some suggestion of the shift in power that need creates. Alara's help did not carry this. It carried something else entirely. It carried the quiet assurance of someone who regarded the practical work of caring for another person as simply that, practical, decent, and worthy of the same attention and craft as any other work done well. Edward was a man who had respected competence his entire life, sometimes more than he had respected the people attached to it. What he was beginning to feel for Alara was different, and he recognized the difference clearly, even if the recognition took him some time to settle into comfortably. It was not respect for what she did in the abstract. It was something more specific, more personal. It was the recognition of a person, someone who was actually there, in his house, in his days, attending to his life, with a quality of care that was both professional and entirely human. He had not spoken to her directly about any of this. He was not sure he knew how, but he had begun to speak to her at all, which was its own kind of start. But it happened in small ways. When she brought his tea, he sometimes asked a question rather than accepting the tray in silence. Not a big question, not the kind of question that required disclosure or intimacy. Practical questions, or questions about the house, or once, a question about the weather forecast, which she answered accurately and without fuss. But he listened to her answer with attention, and she noticed that he did, and they were beginning to occupy the same space, with a slight but genuine ease that had not been there 6 months ago. Mrs. Garland noticed this. Henry noticed it, though he would not have said so to anyone. Helen noticed it, and mentioned it to no one, because she was 22, and instinctively understood that some things become smaller the moment you describe them out loud. And Alara, who noticed most things, noticed it too. She did not examine it as something significant in the way others might have. What she saw was simply a man who was learning, at 67, and against every instinct his life had built in him, to allow himself to be seen. And she understood that this was difficult work, more difficult than the stairs and the cups and the buttons and the trembling, because it required something that none of those physical challenges required. It required trust. She did not push it. She would not have known how to push it, even if she had wanted to. What she did was continue to show up, on time, and attentive, and quiet, and steady, the way she always had. And in that steadiness, in the simple, reliable fact of her presence, something was being built that neither of them had planned, and both of them were beginning to feel. December brought a letter from Portia. It was warm in tone, warmer than Portia's letters usually were, which made Edward read it more slowly than he would otherwise have done. Portia wrote that she had been thinking of him, and that she hoped the autumn had not been too hard. She mentioned Christmas, and said that she and Charles were planning to be at their own home for the holiday, but that she hoped Edward might consider joining them, if he felt up to the journey. She said it with genuine warmth, or with what Edward read as genuine warmth, and he sat with the letter for a long time, and thought about how people sometimes mean well, and still get things wrong in the same moment. He wrote back. He thanked her for the invitation. He said the journey was not something he felt he could manage this year, but that he appreciated her thinking of him. He said he hoped she and Charles had a pleasant Christmas. He sealed the letter and gave it to Henry to post, and he did not think about it afterward, because thinking about it afterward served no useful purpose, and Edward had always been a man who tried not to spend time on things that served no purpose. What he thought about instead, and more often than he had expected, was December, the month itself. The way Renfield Manor took on a different character in December. The way the light inside the house became warmer in proportion to the cold outside. The way the old building seemed to draw inward and become more itself. He thought about the Decembers that had been full and loud when the children were young, and Dorothy had filled the house with small decorations and baked things and people coming and going. He thought about the Decembers after the children left, which had been quieter, but still 2 of them. And he thought about this December, which would be the 3rd since Dorothy died, and the 1st in which he was unambiguously and significantly unwell. On a Thursday evening in the 2nd week of December, Edward was sitting in the study after dinner, the fire well built and the lamp lit on his desk, when he heard a sound from somewhere in the lower corridor. It was not alarming, nothing more than a door and then quiet steps, the ordinary sounds of the house in the evening. But something made him look up from the book he was not reading, and a few minutes later, through the open study door, he saw Alara pass in the corridor, carrying a small basket of folded linens, toward the linen cupboard at the far end of the hall. She did not look in as she passed, but she moved with that particular quality she had, unhurried and aware, and something about the sight of her in the corridor, a person going about an ordinary task in the evening quiet of the house, struck Edward in a way he had not anticipated. It was not dramatic. It was almost its opposite. It was the quietness of it, the ordinariness, the fact that she was simply there, as she had been for 3 years, going about her work with more care for his well-being than he had been paying attention to for most of that time. He looked back at his book. He read the same line 3 times. Then he set the book down and looked at the fire, and thought about the nature of presence, about the different ways it can be offered, and the different ways it can be received, about the things a person can fail to see, simply because they are not looking in the direction where those things are occurring. A few minutes later, Elara came back down the corridor, the basket empty now. This time she paused at the study doorway. Briefly, she said that the fire in the main sitting room was burning low, and asked whether he would like her to build it up before she left for the evening. Edward said that he would. She went to do it. He listened to the small sounds from down the corridor, the careful work with the coal and the grate, the quiet efficiency of someone who has done a task enough times to have made peace with it. When she passed the study again on her way to the back of the house, he said goodnight. She said goodnight, sir, in that tone she had, that was neither formal nor familiar, but was somewhere between the two, and suited exactly to the kind of exchange they were navigating. And then she was gone, and the house settled back into its winter quiet, and Edward sat by his fire for a long time, and was, for the first time in many months, not particularly aware of the silence. The phone call from Gerald came on a Wednesday in December, mid-afternoon. Edward was at his desk, going through the estate accounts that his solicitor had sent, when Henry knocked and said there was a call. Edward went to the telephone in the hallway, which he still preferred to the extension in the study, and picked it up. Gerald's voice came through with the particular clarity of someone who has prepared what they want to say before dialing. He asked after Edward's health. Edward said he was managing. Gerald said that was good to hear, and then, without much pause, moved into the substance of the call, which was a question about one of the provisions in the estate documents and whether Edward had spoken yet with the solicitor about the clause that governed the land management agreement. They spoke for 11 minutes. Edward answered the questions clearly and accurately. Gerald said he would follow up in writing. Edward said that would be fine. They said goodbye. Edward stood in the hallway after replacing the receiver and looked at the wall for a moment. Then he went back to the study and returned to the accounts. What he did not do, for the rest of that day and into the evening, was think about the phone call. He had become quite good at not thinking about things that had revealed themselves fully in the experience of them. Gerald had called for information and received it. That was the shape of the relationship as it currently stood. Edward could be angry about this, or grieved by it, or disappointed, in ways that were old and deeply familiar, and attached to things that had started long before the diagnosis. But these were all expensive responses that led nowhere useful, and Edward was running a household on a limited reserve of energy, and he had decided, without articulating the decision, to spend that energy where it returned something. Where it returned something was becoming clearer to him, as December moved through its short gray days. Elara had by now established, without either of them naming it as such, a routine of morning and evening attendance to the Duke's more immediate needs that sat alongside her regular household duties without replacing them. She came with the breakfast tray at 7:30 and stayed long enough to note what was needed and ensure the room was set appropriately for the day. In the evening, she made a final pass through the rooms he used most, checking the fires, adjusting whatever needed adjusting, and exchanging the few words that had become their version of an exchange. It was not much, in objective terms, but it was consistent, and in Edward's life as it currently stood, consistency was one of the most valuable things available. He had asked her, one morning in the second week of December, how long she had worked at Renfield. She had said 3 years in March. He had said that time moved differently in the winter, which was not something he had planned to say, but which came out of his mouth as a true thing. She had agreed. In the unforced way she agreed with things that she actually agreed with, rather than things she was agreeing with for the sake of agreeing. Then she had asked whether he would like the curtains opened or left, since the morning was cloudy and the light was flat, and he had said to leave them half-drawn, and that had been the end of it. But it had been something. He was aware that it had been something. The hardest days in December were the ones when the fatigue came without warning and descended completely, leaving him not in pain exactly, but emptied, as if whatever fuel he had been running on had been quietly consumed, without his noticing, until there was nothing left. On these days, he did not go to the study. He did not manage correspondence, or review documents, or make the effort of ordinary engagement with the world. He sat in the bedroom chair, or lay on top of the bed with his eyes open, not sleeping, not really resting, just occupying his body in whatever configuration required the least from it. These days were the ones he disliked most, not for the physical difficulty, but for what they took from him in terms of the sense of himself that he most depended on. He was a man defined by his ability to engage with his world, to make decisions, to manage and consider and act. Days when this was not available to him were days when he was confronted with the version of himself that existed without those capacities, and that version was harder to be. On one such day, a Tuesday in the 3rd week of December, he was in the bedroom chair around midday when Alara knocked softly and looked in. She took in the scene without making it into one. She asked if he would like the chair moved closer to the window, since there was a little sun that morning. He said yes, but added that it was not worth the trouble. She said it was no trouble at all, and moved the chair in 3 efficient and quiet movements, and the winter sun, thin but present, came across the arm of the chair and his hands. He sat in it, and said nothing for a moment. Then he said that it was better. She said that she was glad, and she left. Edward sat in the sun and thought about what it meant to have someone in your life who did small things well, consistently, and without the need to be thanked for them or acknowledged in any particular way. It was different from being served. He had been served his entire life and knew exactly what that felt like. This was different. It had something in it of being cared about, which was a distinction he had not expected to be making about a member of his household staff, and which, once made, refused to be unmade. Christmas came and went with quiet dignity. There was no family visit in the end. Portia sent a gift through the post, a book he had mentioned once having read in his youth, and he was surprised she remembered, and more surprised than he wanted to be by the surprise. Gerald sent a card. Oliver telephoned on Christmas morning and spoke for 8 minutes, and was, in those 8 minutes, more openly warm than Edward had heard him in some time, which Edward filed under the category of Christmas, and did not draw excessive conclusions from. The staff were given the holiday in shifts, with enough overlap that the house was attended at all times. Alara had offered to stay through Christmas Day, which was not required. Edward had told her she should go home to her family. She had gone, and the house had been attended by the rotating presence of the others, and it had been perfectly fine. But Edward had noticed, in a way he allowed himself to notice only briefly, before setting it aside, that the day had a slightly different texture in her absence. Not emptier, not worse, exactly, but less precisely attuned to him, in the way that only becomes visible when the precision is temporarily absent. She returned on the morning of the 27th, and said good morning in the corridor, and asked how the holiday had been. Edward said it had been quiet and pleasant. She said that was good to hear, and went about her work, and the house settled back into its usual rhythm, and Edward found himself thinking, in the study that afternoon with the winter light on the west garden, that quiet and pleasant was perhaps more than some people managed at Christmas, and that it was more than he had expected, and that a part of the reason it had been both of those things, and not only quiet, was standing somewhere down the corridor, straightening something that did not need straightening, attending to a house and a life that were not technically hers to attend to, but that she attended to anyway, with more grace than most people managed for their own. He was a man who had always understood things clearly and expressed them rarely. He understood this clearly. He held it, the way he held most things, quietly and without performance. But holding it changed something. It changed the quality of the days. It changed the way he occupied the house and the winter, and his own particular version of managing. And outside, in the west garden, the bare rose stems that Dorothy had planted stood in their complicated and deliberate arrangement, stripped to nothing, waiting, with the patience of things that have deep roots and know exactly what they are supposed to become when the right season arrives. The new year came to Renfield Manor without celebration, as it had come for the past 3 years. Edward had never been a man for the performative marking of time. The year turned, as it always did, somewhere in the quiet middle of the night, and he was asleep when it did so, and when he woke on the 1st of January, it was simply morning, cold and gray, and beginning in the same way most mornings begin, with light coming gradually through the curtain, and the first sounds of the house starting its day. What was different about this January was Edward himself. Not dramatically different, not visibly different to anyone who might have looked at him from a distance. But there was something in him that had shifted over the course of December, settled into a new configuration, like a joint that has been uncomfortable for a long time, and has finally found an angle that allows for movement without pain. He was not at peace with his illness. He was not resigned to it in any passive or defeated way. But he had arrived at something that might be called acceptance. And acceptance, he was discovering, was not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of honesty. It was simply the decision to stop spending energy on the gap between what was and what used to be, and to direct that energy instead toward what was in front of him. What was in front of him, in concrete and daily terms, was the estate and its management, which he was adjusting carefully to account for his reduced capacity. It was his correspondence, which had become more selective and more deliberate. It was his conversations with Dr. Wells, which had grown, without either of them quite deciding it, into something slightly warmer than a purely clinical relationship. It was the view from the west window, which he returned to often, and which continued to offer something he could not precisely name, and it was, increasingly, and with a reality he had stopped trying to minimize, the daily presence of Alara Moss. January brought a development he had not anticipated. It arrived on a Monday morning, in the form of a letter from Gerald, which was not unusual, but whose contents were. Gerald wrote to say that he had been speaking with Portia, and that they had jointly decided, out of concern for their father's well-being, to engage a professional caregiving agency to provide a full-time attendant at Renfield Manor. Gerald wrote that this was being done with the best intentions, and that arrangements were already in process. He included the name of the agency and the name of the manager there who would be handling the placement. He said the attendant would arrive within the fortnight. Edward read this letter twice. Then he set it on the desk and looked out the window for a long moment. Then he picked up the telephone and called Gerald. The conversation was not comfortable for either of them, Edward said, with the level and deliberate tone he used when he wanted something to be understood precisely and without ambiguity. That he appreciated his son's concern, but that he had not been consulted about this arrangement, and that he should have been. He said that the household was functioning adequately under the current staff, and that a change of this nature required his input and agreement before action was taken. Gerald said that they had made the decision in light of the seriousness of the situation, and that they had acted quickly because the situation seemed urgent. Edward said that urgency was not the same as emergency, and that he was capable of assessing his own situation without having decisions made about it in his absence. There was a silence. Then Gerald said that he understood, and that he would hold the arrangement pending a further discussion. Edward said that would be appropriate. He said goodbye and replaced the receiver. He stood in the hallway for a moment. Then he went back to the study and sat at the desk and was quiet for a while. The truth was more complicated than what he had said to Gerald, and he knew it. The truth was that he did need more help. Dr. Wells had said so, in careful terms, at their last appointment. The truth was that the current arrangement, as quietly effective as Alara had made it, was being sustained by a combination of her attentiveness and his own management, and there were points ahead on the road that would require more than either of those things alone. He was not foolish. He understood his own trajectory. But there was a difference between accepting that he needed help and having his children arrange that help without speaking to him first, and the difference was not about pride in the way that people sometimes use the word pride to mean stubbornness or vanity. It was about personhood, about the right to be a participant in decisions about your own life. And this was something that Gerald, in his efficient and organized way, had managed to miss entirely. Edward wrote to Gerald that evening. It was one of the clearest letters he had written in some time. He said that he was willing to discuss additional household support and that he wanted to be part of that conversation from the beginning. He said that the staff currently at Renfield were known to him and trustworthy, and that any expansion of support should take that existing foundation into account. He said that he would speak with Dr. Wells about what was most appropriate and would communicate his conclusions to Gerald and Portia together. He signed it with his full name, which he did only when he wanted the weight of it to be felt. He sealed the letter and gave it to Alara to post, and she took it without comment, and the matter was set in motion. What followed over the next 2 weeks was a series of conversations, with Dr. Wells, with his solicitor, and eventually with Gerald and Portia together, In a telephone call that was the most direct communication he had had with both of his elder children simultaneously in some years, Edward outlined what he understood about his current needs and likely future needs. He described the household as it stood and the ways in which the staff were already managing above and beyond their formal duties. He said that if expanded support was required, he wanted it to be integrated thoughtfully and not imposed abruptly. Gerald and Portia both listened. There was a tone to the conversation that was different from the ones that had preceded it, something slightly more real, slightly less managed. Portia asked a genuine question about how Edward was finding the days. He answered it with more honesty than he would have managed a month earlier. When the call ended, Edward sat in the study for a while. It had not resolved everything. Nothing about what was ahead would resolve cleanly or permanently. But something had shifted, in the shape of the conversation, and in the way he had engaged with it. He had been honest about needing help. He had been clear about wanting to be involved in how that help was arranged, and he had, perhaps for the first time since the diagnosis, conducted a conversation with his children in which the pretense of managing perfectly had been, at least partly, set down. He thought about this for a while. He thought about the long habit of self-sufficiency and what it costs and who pays that cost. He thought about Dorothy and the things she had tried to tell him over the years, about softness, about allowing people in, about the difference between strength that protects and strength that simply refuses to be seen. He thought she would have been amused, in her gentle way, that it had taken this particular set of circumstances to begin teaching him what she had tried to teach him for 40 years. Elara came with the afternoon tea at 3 o'clock. She set the tray on the corner of the desk and turned to go. Edward said her name, which stopped her. She turned back. He said that he wanted to thank her for what she had been doing over the past several months. Not anything specific. All of it. She looked at him in that way she had, direct and calm, and not filling the silence with anything unnecessary. She said that she was glad it had been helpful. He said that was an understatement, which was as close as he was going to come, and they both understood this, and it was enough. She asked if there was anything else he needed. He said no. She went back to her work. Edward picked up his tea, which was exactly the right temperature, and looked out at the January garden, and felt something settle further into place inside him, quiet and solid and overdue. The morning Edward Ashford was found on the floor of the upstairs corridor was a Thursday in February, and Elara was the one who found him. She had come up the back stairs at 6:30, earlier than usual because she had woken before her alarm, and the quiet restlessness of early morning had brought her to the manor ahead of schedule. The corridor was lit only by the gray light coming through the window at the far end. She was carrying nothing, having come up to check that the fire in the Duke's room had been properly banked the evening before, which Henry was usually responsible for, but which she had realized, halfway through her morning cup of tea at home, she had not confirmed. She saw him before she was fully around the corner, and her body moved before her mind had finished processing what she was seeing. She was beside him in seconds. He was on his side on the cold stone floor, one hand stretched out toward the wall, the other beneath him. He was conscious, his eyes open, and the first thing he said when he saw her was that he was perfectly fine, which was so far from true that it would have been almost amusing under different circumstances. She said she understood, and touched his shoulder gently, and asked where it hurt. He said his right hip and his pride, and she said that one of those she could do something about. She did not panic. She had not panicked once in the minutes between seeing him and being beside him, not because she was cold or unaffected, but because panic was not useful to him, and she knew it. And in that moment, his needs were the entire geometry of her attention. She assessed without drama. His arms were moving and responsive. His voice was clear. The hip was the concern, and it required help beyond what she could offer alone. She told him she was going to get Henry, who was the strongest person in the house, and already on the grounds. She told him she was going to be back in under 4 minutes. She told him to stay as still as he comfortably could, and to talk to her, while she ran if he needed to, because she would leave the door at the top of the stairs open, so she could hear him. He said he was not going to talk to an open stairwell door at 6:30 in the morning. She said that was fine, and that she would be back quickly. And she was. Henry came up the stairs at a pace that was remarkable for a man whose back troubled him in cold weather, and between the two of them, Elara guiding and Henry bearing the weight, they got Edward off the floor and onto the bed. Elara telephoned Dr. Wells, while Henry stayed with the Duke. and Wells arrived within 40 minutes, efficient and unhurried in the way of people who have responded to medical situations long enough that the urgency does not impair the clarity. The hip was badly bruised but not broken, which Wells confirmed with careful examination, and which Edward received with a relief that he did not fully hide. The first time Alara could remember seeing him fail to compose a reaction before it showed. Wells stayed for an hour. He spoke with Edward at length, some of it in Alara's presence, and some of it not. When she was in the room, she paid attention in the way she always did, quietly and thoroughly, and when she was asked to give them privacy, she went downstairs and put the kettle on and waited. The questions she had in her mind were practical ones, about what the coming days would require, about what would need adjusting, and how, and when. She did not have questions that were less useful than this, or at least she had them, and set them aside, which was not the same thing but would serve. Wells came down to the kitchen before he left. He found Alara at the table with a cup of tea, and his own cup ready beside it, which he noticed with the brief expression of a man who is used to noticing things, and appreciates when others are too. He sat down. He spoke to her for 12 minutes. He told her what the fall meant in the context of the Duke's condition, and what it suggested about the coming weeks. He asked her, with the directness of someone who has stopped needing to be diplomatic about what is actually required, whether she was able to increase her time at the manor. He said it plainly, that the Duke needed someone who knew him and whom he trusted, and that in his assessment, she was currently the person who best filled that description in this household. Alara was quiet for a moment. She thought about her mother and her siblings. She thought about the things she had understood about herself since she was 16, about where she was most fully present and most genuinely needed. She said yes. Wells said good and drank his tea and left. But upstairs, Edward was in bed, which he found deeply inconvenient, and said so to Henry. When Henry came up to check on him, Henry said that it was only for a day or two, and that he should rest. Edward said he was not a man who rested. Henry said with respect that the floor had offered its opinion on that matter this morning, and perhaps the Duke might consider it. Edward looked at Henry for a moment. Then he said, that was more insubordination than he had received from a member of his staff in 31 years. Henry said he was glad to break the record. Edward almost smiled. Henry went back to the grounds. Alara came up mid-morning, with the tea tray, and found the Duke propped against the pillows, looking at the ceiling, with the expression of a man negotiating with an outcome he has not chosen. She asked if he had slept. He said not particularly. She said that was not unusual after a fall, and that sleep would likely come more easily tonight. He said he was not interested in medical observation. She said she understood, and poured his tea, and set it where his hand could reach it without stretching. Then she pulled the chair that was usually by the window to the side of the bed, and sat down in it. Not in the deferential way of someone offering attendance, in the straightforward way of someone taking a seat, because she intended to be in it for a while. Edward looked at her. She looked back at him, with perfect equanimity. He said she did not need to sit with him. She said she was going to anyway. He said that was impertinent. She said she thought of it more as thorough. There was a silence that was not uncomfortable. Outside the window, the February light was pale and still, the garden dormant and dark, the old oaks at the field edge standing without movement in the cold air. Edward drank his tea. Alara sat in the chair, with her hands in her lap, and did not fidget or fill the quiet with talk, because she understood that quiet was not always something that needed filling. After a while, Edward said that she had managed the situation very well this morning. Alara said she was glad. He said that she moved quickly when she needed to. She said she had learned from watching people who didn't, and that the lesson was a useful one. He was quiet again. Then he said that he had been thinking, over the past few weeks, about the arrangement of the household, and that there were some changes he intended to discuss with Dr. Wells and with his solicitor. Alara said nothing, because she could tell he was still forming what he wanted to say. He said that the people who showed up for a person were not always the people you expected, and that he was beginning to understand that the right response to that was not resentment but adjustment. Adjustment in the practical sense, and in some other sense he had not quite found the word for yet. Alara listened to this. She said that she thought that sounded right. He said that she was very calm, for a person who had found a Duke on the floor at 6:30 in the morning. She said that she had not been calm, she had simply not let it show, which was a different thing. He considered this. He said that was a useful distinction. She agreed that it was. They sat together in the winter quiet of the manor bedroom. The old house doing what old houses do in the presence of difficult things, which is to hold them without judgment, to let the walls absorb what the people inside them cannot always say, to simply continue being what they have always been. Outside the window, in the dark earth of the West Garden, Dorothy Ashford's rose roots waited for February to finish its work, and for something warmer to begin. The days following the fall were quieter than Edward would have chosen, but more productive than he had expected. He remained in the bedroom for the first 2 days, on Dr. Wells's recommendation, which he complied with, not because he had accepted the recommendation without resistance, but because Alara had pointed out, without preamble, that the bedroom had better light in the morning than the study, and that the estate accounts he needed to review could be brought up from the desk without any difficulty. This reframing of the enforced rest as a practical relocation rather than a capitulation was precisely the kind of adjustment that Edward had begun to understand was one of Alara's gifts. His solicitor, a patient man named Mr. Crane, came on the 3rd day and sat with Edward for 2 hours while they went through the documents that needed attention. Alara brought tea at the appropriate intervals and otherwise remained at the edges of the arrangement, available without being present. Mr. Crane, who was not given to commenting on household matters, said before he left that the Duke appeared to be well looked after, which was not a complicated observation, but which carried in it, delivered to a man who had been conducting his affairs from a sickbed, a quality of recognition that Edward acknowledged with a brief nod. On the 5th day, Edward came downstairs again, slowly, with Alara a step behind him on the staircase, close but not holding, present but not assuming. Edward walked to the study, and sat at his desk, and looked at the familiar room, the books reaching to the ceiling, the west window, the garden beyond it. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said that it was good to be back. Alara said that she was glad, and asked if he wanted the fire built up. He said yes. She built it. He returned to his correspondence, and the house continued its day around him, and the rhythm of Renfield Manor reasserted itself, with the patient confidence of something that has learned to carry whatever is placed upon it. What had changed, in the days since the fall, was not the house or its routines, but the degree to which Edward had stopped pretending. Not entirely, not in every respect. There were things he still managed in ways that required more from him than they would have cost him 6 months ago, and there were things he did not say, and would not say, but some of the energy that had been going into the performance of perfect management had been redirected, not into helplessness, into honesty, which is entirely different, and considerably more useful. He had been honest with Gerald and Portia in the telephone conversation following the fall, which Gerald had initiated, and which had a different quality from the ones that came before it. Portia had cried briefly, which neither of them acknowledged directly, but which Edward registered and did not dismiss. Gerald had asked practical questions, and listened to the answers. There had been a moment near the end of the call when Gerald said that he was sorry he hadn't been there. Edward said that what mattered was what happened going forward. Gerald said that was very like his father to say. Edward said he was not sure how to take that. Gerald said he meant it as a compliment. Edward said, in that case he accepted it. It was the closest thing to warmth their relationship had managed in a long time. Edward did not inflate it. It was what it was, which was a beginning, and beginnings, when they arrive late, are still beginnings. Oliver appeared on a Saturday, in the middle of February, having heard about the fall from Gerald, and driven down without calling first. He arrived looking genuinely undone, in a way that he did not try to compose, which was one of the things about Oliver that could be either infuriating or endearing, depending on the moment. He sat across from Edward in the small sitting room and said that he had been an idiot. Edward said that he had noted this some time ago, and was glad Oliver had arrived at the same conclusion. Oliver said he meant it seriously. Edward said he understood that. Oliver said he wanted to do better. Edward said that better was available, that the opportunity for it was not closed, and that actions over time were more meaningful than declarations in a sitting room, however sincerely delivered. Oliver took this in. He asked what he could actually do. Edward said that regular contact would be a start, not visits necessarily, since Oliver lived at a distance, but letters and telephone calls, and the effort of consistent attention. He said that what he required from his children was not their physical presence at all times, which was not realistic, but the knowledge that he was in their minds regularly and with genuine care. Oliver said he could do that. Edward said he hoped so. They sat together for a while longer, talking about less significant things, and it was easier than it had been. And while Edward did not allow himself to expect too much from the ease, he did allow himself to notice it. What was building in Edward's life during February and into the early days of March was not something he could have named precisely, but its nature was becoming clearer. It was a form of life that was different from the one he had been living before the illness, and different again from the diminished and contracted life he had feared he was being pressed toward. It was smaller in some ways, more interior, more dependent on others than it used to be. But it was also, and this surprised him in a way he continued to process, more honestly itself than anything he had lived since Dorothy died. He had spent the years after Dorothy's death in a holding pattern, maintaining everything he was supposed to maintain, managing everything he was supposed to manage, and not looking too directly at the fact that the thing holding all of it together had been removed, and the structure was standing on old habit, rather than anything living. The illness had forced him to stop. It had forced a kind of reckoning that he would not have chosen, and that had taught him things he could not have learned without it. One of those things was that the version of strength he had practiced his whole life, the version that needed nothing, showed nothing, received help from no one, was not strength in the way he had understood strength to be. It was armor, and armor, worn long enough, stops protecting the person inside it and starts instead to limit them, to restrict what they can feel and offer and receive. He had worn this armor for 67 years, some of it given to him by his father, some of it built himself over decades of being the Duke of Renfield, the man who managed, the man who held things together. And now, because of a diagnosis, and a broken glass, and a fall in a corridor, and a young woman who had arrived at his side in the gray light of a February morning, and told him she was going to get Henry, and be back in 4 minutes, the armor had gaps in it. And through the gaps was coming something that felt, against every expectation, like air. Elara was now spending most of her working day at the manor, her duties adjusted to provide more direct support to Edward, and less of the general household work, which had been redistributed. This had been arranged formally, through a conversation, between Edward and the household accounts, and the arrangement was clear and dignified in all the ways that mattered for both of them. Elara had also begun, on 2 evenings a week, to stay past her usual end of day, which was her own choice, and which Edward had accepted, on the condition that she was compensated for the additional time. She had said that was not necessary. He had said that it was not negotiable. She had agreed. And that had been the end of the conversation, which was the way most of their important conversations ended, in the clean resolution of 2 people who understood each other. In the evenings when she stayed, they had begun the habit of spending an hour in the study together, Elara reading, while Edward read, or reviewed correspondence, or simply sat by the fire. They did not always speak. The not speaking was by now a comfortable thing between them, a shared silence that was different from the silence of a room with one person in it. Elara had an instinct for when Edward wanted quiet and when he was open to conversation, and she navigated this without being asked to, the way she navigated most things. They talked, sometimes, about things that were not the house or his health. She told him about her family, her mother and her brother and the village she had grown up in, and he listened with a quality of attention that she recognized as the same attention he gave to estate decisions or medical reports, which was the most complete attention he had. He told her about Dorothy, not often, but sometimes, in the way that a person tells you about someone they loved when they have begun to trust you enough to allow the love to show. Elara listened to these fragments, the way she listened to everything, without trying to make them into more than they were, which meant they could be exactly what they were. On an evening in the first week of March, with the fire bright and the night pressing against the study windows, Edward looked up from the letter he was reading, and said that he had been thinking about the roses in the west garden. Elara looked up from her book. He said that Dorothy had designed that garden herself, every plant in it placed according to a plan she had drawn on graph paper 20 years ago. He said that in the years since her death, the garden had been maintained, but not tended in the way she had intended, which was his own failure of attention, and Henry's honest limitations with ornamental gardens, as opposed to productive ones. He said that he was thinking about restoring it properly in the spring, and that he wanted it done the way Dorothy had planned it, which meant he would need to find the original graph paper plans, which were somewhere in her writing desk. Alara said she could help look for them if he liked. He said he would appreciate that. She said she would start tomorrow, with his permission. He said she had it. What he did not say, and what the evening contained nonetheless, was the thing that had been building through all the months of autumn and winter, through the broken glass, and the letters that came and went, and the fall in the corridor, and the hour they had spent in the bedroom, with the pale February light at the window. It was not a simple thing, and it was not a thing he had a name for that fit neatly. It was the recognition of a bond that had grown between two people, who had begun as a duke and a maid in a large old house, and had become, through the particular chemistry of illness and honesty and consistent daily care, something that was not that at all. Something that sat outside the usual categories and demanded its own. Two people who had found in each other what the world had not reliably offered them, which was the sense of being genuinely known by someone who chose to stay. The morning Alara found Dorothy Ashford's garden plans in the bottom drawer of the writing desk. In the east sitting room was a March morning, with the first real warmth of the year coming through the windows, thin but present, and unmistakably different from the winter light that had occupied the house for the past 4 months. The desk had not been opened since Dorothy's death, which Edward had mentioned only once, and had not needed to explain further. Alara had opened it with care, not with ceremony, but with the particular attention she brought to things that mattered to someone she had come to know well enough to understand without being told. The plans were in a cream-colored folder, tied with a piece of string, exactly as Dorothy had left them. There were 6 sheets of graph paper, each one covered in careful pencil marks and notations, in a handwriting that was quick and certain, the handwriting of someone who thought and wrote simultaneously, without losing either. Beside the graph paper sheets were 2 pages of plant notes, listing species and planting depths and spacing requirements, and, in a few places, small observations in brackets, reminders to herself about which varieties needed sun, and which preferred the shelter of the north wall, and one note that simply said, "Check with Edward Re path width, because he will have an opinion." Alara sat with this folder, for a quiet moment, in the east sitting room. The sun was on the carpet. She could hear Henry's footsteps on the gravel below the window. Then she closed the folder carefully, retied the string, and went to find the Duke. Edward was in the study. He was reviewing correspondence, as he was most mornings, with the concentration of a man who has learned to conserve his energy for the things that actually require it. He looked at it for a moment, and something crossed his face that was not grief exactly, and not joy either, but something that contained elements of both. The face of a person encountering an object from a life that is gone, and finding in it not only loss but also the undeniable fact of what was. He said she had found it. She said she had. He asked her to bring it to the desk. She set it in front of him and stepped back. He untied the string himself, with hands that trembled slightly but managed, and opened the folder and looked at the graph paper sheets one by one. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said that she had made notes in the margins. Alara said she had noticed that. He said that the note about his opinion on the path width was entirely accurate, and that he had indeed had an opinion at the time. Alara asked what the opinion had been. He said that he had thought the path should be wider. She asked if Dorothy had agreed. He said that Dorothy had said the path was the right width, and that his preference for wider paths was a preference for a wider sense of his own importance, which had made him laugh so hard he had to sit down. Alara smiled. Edward looked at the plans again. He said that he wanted the garden restored to what she had intended, exactly, including the path width, and that Henry should be involved from the beginning, since Henry knew the soil and the drainage patterns better than anyone. Alara said she would speak with Henry, and also that she had some experience with garden planning from her mother's kitchen garden, if that would be useful. Edward said it would. They spent the next 2 hours in the study. The plans spread on the desk, Alara and Henry both present, going through each section of the garden, and matching what existed now with what the plans showed had been intended. Henry had his own opinions on several points and expressed them in his direct way, and Edward had his opinions, and Alara had the plans, and the conversation was the most lively and engaged that the study had contained in some time. Mrs. Garland came up at one point to ask about the timing of lunch, and stayed for 10 minutes, because the conversation had caught her interest. And when she left, she said to no one in particular that it was about time the West Garden got some proper attention. Over the following weeks, the garden became a project, and the project became something that occupied a portion of Edward's daily attention in a way that was entirely new and entirely welcome. He could not work the ground himself. This was a fact he accepted without drama. But he could be at the window, and he could walk to the low wall at the edge of the path, on the better days, and he could discuss what was being done, and why, with Henry and Alara and the young assistant Pete, who turned out to have a genuine interest in plants that nobody had previously known about, and who became, under Henry's supervision, one of the project's most useful hands. Edward had begun, in March, to walk a little more than he had been able to during the worst of the winter, on the days when his body allowed it. Not long walks. The route from the manor's south entrance to the low wall at the west garden's edge and back was perhaps 80 meters, which he would not have measured in previous years because it would not have registered as a walk. Now it registered. It was something he did with intention and preparation, choosing the right hour and the right footwear, and not attempting it on the days when his legs were unreliable or the ground was uneven with cold. Alara was usually with him on these walks, not beside him, in the way of support, but near him, in the way of presence. Two people walking in the same direction, at the same pace, with the comfortable ease of people who have found that each other's company requires nothing to justify it. On one such walk in the last week of March, when the first crocuses had pushed up along the path edge, and the morning had a warmth in it that was no longer a promise, but a fact, Edward stopped at the low wall and looked at the garden. The work had been going on for 3 weeks, and the difference was visible. The beds had been cleared, and the dead growth removed, and the good plants identified and preserved, and the gaps marked for what would be planted according to the plans. It looked, at this intermediate stage, like something in the process of becoming, which it was. Edward stood at the wall for a while. Alara stood a little way along from him, looking at the same view. The morning was quiet, except for Pete working somewhere at the far end of the garden, and the ordinary sounds of the estate beginning its day. Edward said that Dorothy would have been impatient with this stage, the looking like nothing stage. She had always found it difficult to hold the vision of the thing that was coming against the reality of the thing that was currently present, which he said was not a weakness but simply the way her attention worked. Alara said that some people saw in stages, and some people saw the whole at once, and both of them had uses. Edward said that Dorothy had seen the whole. He said it without melancholy, which was new, or newer. He said it as a simple truth about a person he had known better than he had known anyone. Alara said she thought the garden would be very beautiful when it was done. Edward said it would be what Dorothy intended it to be, which was better than beautiful, because intended things carried the person who had intended them in a way that accidental beauty did not. Alara was quiet for a moment, looking at the garden, thinking about this. Then she said she agreed. They walked back to the house at the same pace, through the morning that was warm, in the new and honest way of early spring, and the manor received them, as it always did, with the solidity of old stone and old wood, and the particular assurance of a house that has seen many seasons and many people, and has held all of them without preference or judgment. At the door, Edward paused. He turned to look back at the garden from the entrance, which gave a slightly different view from the wall, the whole of it visible in relation to the manor and the grounds. He stood there for a moment. Then he said that the path width was right, as Dorothy had planned it. Alara said she was glad he thought so. He said he had been wrong about it, and she had been right, and he had required 20 years, and some revision of his own character to arrive at this conclusion. Alara said that the conclusion was what mattered, not the time it took. Edward said that was generous. She said it was accurate. And they went inside, into the warm house, into the day that was continuing, as days do, reliably and without ceremony, carrying with it all that had been built inside it, and all that was still, quietly and with great patience, being built. April came to Renfield in the way that the best Aprils come, not in a single dramatic shift, but in a series of small permissions, each one a degree warmer than the last, each one more certain than the one before it. The ground in the west garden softened properly by the second week, and Henry and Pete worked the beds thoroughly, while Alara cross-referenced the planting schedule from Dorothy's notes, and Edward sat at the study window, or at the low wall, watching the progress, with the particular quality of attention that belongs to people who have learned to notice what is in front of them. He was not well, in the way that people sometimes mean when they say that word, as if it describes a total state. His condition was what it was, advancing in its deliberate and unsentimentalized way, requiring more from him and from those around him than it had 6 months ago. Dr. Wells came regularly, and was pleased, and said so, which Wells did not do casually, and what pleased him was not the state of the illness, which was not improvable, but the state of the person inside it. Edward Ashford was, in Wells's clinical assessment, managing his condition with greater support and greater honesty than he had been 6 months prior, and this made a practical difference to his stability and to the quality of what remained. What remained was considerable, though its form had changed. Edward still managed the estate, in partnership now with Gerald, in a way that was better than what had come before, not because the partnership was without friction, but because friction between two people who are both present and engaged is more productive than the smooth avoidance of two people who are not. Gerald came to the manor on the first Friday of April, and they spent the morning going through documents, and the afternoon walking what parts of the grounds Edward could comfortably cover. And Gerald was quieter than his father remembered him being, quieter in the particular way of people who are paying attention rather than speaking. Edward noted this, and did not comment on it, but he allowed it to matter. Portia telephoned in the second week of April, and asked if she could come and stay for a few days. Edward said that the East Wing bedroom was available. She came on a Wednesday and stayed until Sunday, and the days of her stay were not without awkwardness, because there was history between them, and history, when it has been accumulated under the terms of difficulty and distance, does not dissolve simply by virtue of proximity. But Portia was genuinely present in a way she had not been before, and she helped Mrs. Garland with something in the kitchen one afternoon, and she walked with Edward to the garden wall on the Saturday morning, and stood looking at the beds with the expression of someone who is trying to reconstruct something she should not have let herself forget. On the last evening she sat with Edward in the study after dinner, and said that she was sorry for the autumn and the winter. Edward said that he understood the limits of what people can offer when they are afraid. Portia looked at him. She said that was more generous than she deserved. He said it was what was true, and that in his experience, what was true was nearly always more useful than what was deserved. Oliver had been in touch consistently since February, which had been his commitment and which he had maintained. Letters came on alternate weeks, genuine ones, with real information about his life, and genuine questions about his father's. Edward wrote back at similar intervals, and the correspondence between them became, over those months, something that neither of them had expected it to be, which was a connection that had substance. Oliver telephoned on a Saturday afternoon in April, and they talked for 40 minutes, and Edward afterward sat in the study and thought about the fact that a conversation with his youngest son of 40 minutes could be both easy and meaningful, and that this had not been the case a year ago, and that the thing that had changed was not Oliver's character, but the honesty with which Edward was meeting it. Alara was present through all of this, in the ways she had become present, steady and attentive, and never inserting herself into the family territory that was not hers to enter. She understood the architecture of what she occupied in Edward's life, with the same clarity she brought to the architecture of the manor, knowing which rooms were hers to attend, and which ones she supported from the doorway. She was not family. She was not staff, in the way the word had meant before. She was something that existed between those two categories, or perhaps beyond them both. A person who had been there, consistently and without reservation, through the months that had tested everything, and found certain things hollow, and found others, unexpectedly, full. Edward had spoken with his solicitor, Mr. Crane, in March, and then again in April, about revisions to certain documents that governed the estate, and the provisions made for various people connected to his life and household. These conversations were not dramatic. They were conducted in the careful and precise language of legal arrangements, but behind them was a set of decisions that Edward had made with greater clarity than most of the decisions he had made in recent years, because they came from the part of him that had been most recently and most honestly used. The provisions he made for Alara and for her family were not excessive. They were not a reward in the transactional sense of the word. They were an acknowledgement, made in the language available to a duke who understood that certain kinds of gratitude outgrow the words for them and must therefore be expressed in more durable forms. He had told Alara, simply and directly, in the study one morning, that he had made arrangements that he wanted her to know about. He described them without fuss. She was quiet when he finished. Then she said that she had not done any of it for this reason. He said he knew that. He said that was part of why the arrangements were right. She looked at him for a moment, and then said thank you, which she said in the way that people say those words when they mean all the other things the words are standing in for. He said she was welcome, which was the same kind of standing in, and they both understood it, and let it be enough. May arrived. The West Garden was coming alive, according to Dorothy's plan. The plants establishing themselves in the positions she had chosen 20 years ago. The path, the right width, the spacing between beds, exactly as she had drawn it on the graph paper. Edward stood at the low wall one morning in the middle of the month and looked at it, at all of it. The geometry of her intention made actual. The evidence of a love that had been expressed through careful attention to things that grow. And he felt something that was grief, and something that was gratitude, and something that was entirely present and alive and belonging to this morning, this light, this garden that was doing what it was supposed to do. Alara was beside him. The morning was warm. Pete was working at the far end. Henry was somewhere beyond the north hedge, doing something that involved an intermittent sound of purposeful labor. The manor stood at their backs, old and solid, and entirely itself, the same house that had stood there through every version of the life that had been lived inside it. Edward said that he thought Dorothy would have liked how it was turning out. Alara said she thought so too. He said that he was glad the plans were found, and that the right people had been here to use them. He said this with a deliberateness that made clear he was not talking only about the garden. Alara said she was glad too, and she said it in a way that accepted what he meant, without requiring him to say it more plainly than he was capable of saying it, which was one of the things about her that he had come to understand, was not a small gift, but a very large one. They stood at the wall for a while longer, in the morning light, in the warmth of a May that had arrived honestly and without apology, above a garden that was becoming what someone good and careful had always intended it to be. Edward Ashford was not a man who had been changed by his illness into someone unrecognizable. He was still the Duke of Renfield. He was still precise and demanding, and not particularly given to sentiment expressed in obvious ways. He still had opinions about path widths, and still believed that directness was more respectful than softness, and still read more before breakfast than most people read in a week. He was still, in most of the ways that mattered, himself, but he was himself differently, more honestly, more open to what was in front of him, less armored against it, more aware of where the actual substance of his life resided, not in the title or the estate or the management of things, though those mattered, but in the connections that had proved themselves real through the months when the easier ones had not shown up, in the persistence of a groundskeeper who joked with him when it was what he needed, in the cook who put shortbread on a tray without being asked, in a son who was trying, in daughters who were, in their imperfect and delayed way, arriving, and in a young woman named Alara Moss, who had found him on the floor of a corridor in the gray February light, and looked after him, not because it was required, and not because it would be rewarded, but because she was built for exactly this, for seeing what was needed, and showing up for it, day after day, in the way that real care always works, not in the grand gesture, but in the daily return. In the study that evening, the fire lit, the May dusk coming through the west window in long shades of orange and rose. Edward sat at his desk and picked up a pen, which still required more deliberate management from his hand than it used to, and began to write. Not a letter about estate documents. Not a letter to the solicitor. A letter to each of his 3 children, personal ones, the kind he had rarely written in his life, because the armor had made them difficult. He wrote to Gerald about the strength he recognized in him, and the distance that strength had sometimes maintained, and what he hoped might change. He wrote to Portia about the woman her mother had been, and the things Dorothy had seen in Portia that Edward had not always said. He wrote to Oliver about the 40-minute telephone call, and what it had meant, and what he hoped for going forward. He wrote 3 letters and sealed them, and set them by the door to be posted. Then he sat by the fire and looked at the room he had occupied for most of his life, the books and the window and the chair where Dorothy used to read, and the open doorway that now, most evenings, held the presence of someone moving through the corridor beyond it, attending to the house and to the life inside it, with the quiet and consistent care that had become, over the course of this long and difficult and unexpectedly full year, the most reliable thing in Edward Ashford's world. He was not fixed. He would not be fixed. The condition continued its progress and would continue, and there were things ahead that would be harder than what had come before. But he was not alone in the way he had been alone for the 4 years since Dorothy died. The insulated and armored aloneness of a man who had decided, without fully deciding, that the vulnerability of connection was too costly to risk again. That decision had been undone, not by anything dramatic. By an accumulation of ordinary mornings, by tea at the right temperature, by a chair moved to the light, by a person who stayed when the others did not, and who in staying had made it possible, slowly and entirely without announcement, for Edward Ashford to begin, at 67 and in the winter of his life, to finally let himself be found. Outside the window, the last of the day's light rested on the west garden, on the plants that were growing now in exactly the arrangement that someone who had loved this place had always intended. The roses that Dorothy had planted were putting out their first new growth of the year, thin green shoots rising from the dark stems she had placed so carefully in the ground 20 years ago, proving once more what they had proved every year without fail, that things with deep roots, left to the right care and the right season, will always find their way back.